about the 7M management and the Shekina cult, because it really is just like a perfect example of exactly what I was talking about in the webinar. And so I want to use that group as an example in that docuseries, like what was revealed in the docuseries. Of course, I know that's not everything, that happened, but to use that as a kind of an example to go through the 6 different themes that I talked about in the webinar, the Breaking Chains webinar that talked about the vulnerabilities that BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people of the global majority, face in the arena of like just the vulnerabilities that we have to being recruited, and the vulnerabilities that groups and leadership of groups exploit in order to recruit people and to keep people from leaving once they're in. And honestly, that the same themes that make it difficult to leave, even if the group weren't trying to, that they were victimized. It's the fault of the person who was the predator. So that's how I feel. And so I don't think that there should be shame or like embarrassment associated with having been recruited in a cult and into a cult. And yet I do understand why people feel that way because of the reactions that they get from other people, which I've received too, even though I didn't even have a choice about getting, into the group that I was born and raised in. Someone asked me also that urgency that can start to take over a group, especially if there is some sort of like crisis, like a legitimate crisis that's happening, like a war or like some sort of, you know, particularly like violent incident or like a natural disaster, something like that. And then, so there's like maybe something legitimate that is happening that is drawing in people's desire to organize, and then that can then spill over into people pushing someone who has leadership qualities and maybe has taken the role of a leader, whether reluctantly or whether they wanted that role or not, um, and pushing that person to like make decisions and to like be in a leadership role in a hierarchy in a way that is indicative of like the culture that we live in, of like that kind of hierarchy where it's like someone has to be in charge, someone has to call the shots, but then putting too much pressure on that person or giving too much adoration or too much credit to that person to, you know, basically give credit to that person for like what the collective of people are doing. And that can go to people's head. It can also, if it's directed at a person who is in a role of leadership, can start to feel like, okay, the whole group is under threat. And you can start to hear this like us versus them language start to arise. And I know that that can happen because I've been in groups where I've seen that kind of dialogues start to come where like maybe there are threats against the leader, maybe the leader, this person isn't maybe even seeing themselves as a leader, maybe they're like someone who's like leading. I noticed it and was able to say like, hey, hold on, like, yes, this person is experiencing threat and they have every right to feel afraid. The rest of us are not being threatened though, and so we need to be careful about using this language of like us versus them. And that's something that, where what are the flags where we are starting to move into like coercion? Where are the flags where we're starting to move into like group think and we're moving into too much urgency where there's not time for people to stop and be like, wait, is this really what we want to do? Like, should there be more people involved in the decision making? Like, because that groups can be culty. They can be, coercive and manipulative, and they can have elements of coercive control without, necessarily meeting the criteria where you're like, this is definitely a cult. But I think that there are some warning signs, and I think it's important for people to know what those warning signs are, not only so you can avoid groups who when you encounter them, but so like me, you can speak up and interrupt the process. Because in my case, when that happened, I spoke up, everyone listened, the people who were teaching and who were in those leadership roles thanked me for speaking up, and they were like, wow, like that you're right, like, we were about to head down this road that actually I'm really glad that you said something, because I don't, now that I've had a moment to pause and reflect, I don't actually wanna go that direction. And to be honest, it's been quite difficult. Like, I've found that because I have a strong aversion to coercion, to authoritarianism, to control, it's been challenging to like stay employed, for example, because many employers use coercion and control tactics to manipulate and exploit their employees. And I'm allergic to that. Like, I just cannot tolerate it. And so I want to transition into talking about this 7M cult. I recently watched the docuseries on Netflix, and it just like, as I was watching it, I haven't actually watched the last episode, so this is just me talking about the first 2 episodes. But I just did the webinar over the weekend, as I mentioned, and now this new docuseries has come out, and as I watched it, because I tend to watch every new cult docuseries that comes out. Um, this group was a perfect example of what I have been talking about and I know that cults often prey on people who are marginalized and misunderstood, and this isn't the fault of the people who get drawn in. It's fully the responsibility of the organization and the leader family, the 2 sisters that were at the beginning of in the first episode that mostly focused on them. As they're being recruited, they have a whole family noticing and saying like, this feels off, and then even when is it Miranda got recruited, fully was in and was like cutting off her family, that you know the whole family is like organizing other parents. They're like going on social media and talking about it, whereas Priscilla and Melanie had no one to be looking out for them in that way, and they both seem to have been in the cult for like several years. I mean, at least one of them had been in the cult for 10 years, or more. Um, and so, I was looking at this and I was just waiting for them to bring up the racial aspect. They did, somewhat mention, being Korean immigrants. They did talk about their vulnerability as kids, like not having parents, but just like the specific way that this cult, because the leader is an East Asian person, and people see churches as places that are safe for their children. So they wouldn't necessarily raise flags that are they're taking the profit themselves, but coercing the people who are part of the organization to volunteer in order to generate that profit. That is labor trafficking, and that's illegal, and it shouldn't be happening. Um, and if you are a kid, or an immigrant, you may not realize that, because this group might be saying, like, we're going to offer you housing, we're going to help you get a car, we're going to help you get rich. This is what this guy is telling people. This Robert, leader of this Shekina church, is telling people that also tend to have this inner circle of people, often people who are women, like Nancy, for example. If you watch The Vow, somebody who's a kind of motherly figure. It seems like there was someone who was like that also, maybe a few people who are like that in the Shekinah church group, who are being used to make the youth comfortable, to make these young women comfortable. And then these women, who are the second line of, the inner circle, around a leader or a leadership group, are used to draw in children, young women, and then they use their position to offer those people up to be exploited by the leadership, whether it's by their labor, exploiting their labor, financially exploiting them, or sexual exploitation. And that's not new. These behaviors have been around for a long time. They are participating in this trafficking. And it's evil. Like, I understand there's a level of like exploitation that they're experiencing, and also they have become part of the exploitation apparatus in that organization, and they should be held accountable for that. This kind of dance management kind of exploitation, where I will not be shocked at all to discover that this person was like keeping the money that the dancers were making, or keeping most of it. I mean, it seemed like they were being required to donate at least half of what they were making back into the group, if not more. And so survivors and people of influence, can I raise the money from community? Because I am not getting institutional support to do this sort of research. And, um, you know, I know it's a big swing, but I thought, if I try this and it amounts to nothing, then I can truthfully say I tried my best. I tried everything, and then in good conscience, I can just give up because I know that nobody cared or it didn't matter and nobody else was struggling. Nobody needed help, telling their stories, and that I just need to lay it to rest because apparently I'm the only one who cares about this. But I'm tired of screaming into a void and not feeling heard. These are not being told. And I want people who want to share their stories to have some ability to share and for it to be cataloged. And I also want that because I want to amplify the stories of cult survivors of color because that is speaking truth to power. And I know there are universal lessons that can be learned from our experience for anyone. And then maybe it won't feel like what we went through was for nothing. Like perhaps something good can come of it. I definitely feel like my experience of being able to give back and be part of a community with a family survival trust has given me a sense of like meaning and purpose. And I do feel like something's missing in that experience because I'm not able to talk about race because there aren't other people of color to have that conversation with in the group. And so I'm looking for other people like me, who see this and are like, yeah, like job and your money and your housing all tied up. So then it makes it really hard for you to leave because everything is attached to the group. And so what do? If your family's in the group, how do you leave without being homeless? How do you find community? How do you find support, whether that's peer support or therapy? I just want there to be locations online, locations of like people, collectives of like therapists and other support people to be able to offer this support in a way that is culturally appropriate for people of color. Think that we need community, and particularly if you're a marginalized person, like you need community. And what we need is the understanding and the knowledge of how to be in community safely and how to recognize the signs when things are starting to go downhill, or if you encounter a group that is already problematic, like how do you recognize this? Also passionate about this if you're a survivor, if you're a researcher and you're like, I love grounded theory research, I want to be a part of this because I have never done grounded theory research. I've looked into it, so I have, and I understand how it works, but I need collaborators. I can't do this by myself, and I don't want this collaboration to be exploitative. And so if you're like, I'm interested in helping to fundraise, I'm interested in helping to contribute, I want to participate in the research, if you're looking for support and you want to connect with like the Family Survival Trust or other, individual supports, then I can share more about that. I am creating a page for that on my website. It's not up just yet, but, connect with me, maybe use the Emergent Phoenix hashtag so that I can find your video on Instagram. I'm not on TikTok. You know, I won't get into social media, but I really don't enjoy it. And so it's like there's like this tension with me because I'm like, oh, I want to put myself out there and I want more people to see this, but I find social media really exhausting actually. And so I have to step in, put my foot in, do a little bit, and then step back out, because I just can't be on it all the time. I find it not good for my mental health, to be completely honest. So I am on it as I'm able to be. And so I'm not on TikTok, but I am on Instagram. You can find me at Emergent Phoenix Rising on Instagram. And probably the best way to reach out to me would be through Instagram or through my website, because those are the two places that I have the most kind of regular interaction. My website for sure, and then Instagram probably like a few times a week. So thank you for listening. If you didn't watch the webinar on breaking chains, or I think it's called Invisible Chains, then please watch that, because I go a lot more into depth into these 6 themes. But this is meant as like a follow-up for the Q